You're a nurse? Look at you. You can't weigh more than 100 pounds, soaking wet. What are you going to do when a real problem comes through that door, followed to death? The words, sharp and dripping with condescension, sliced through the controlled chaos of the Mercy General ER. The crowd of residents and junior nurses, already frayed by a 12-hour shift, offered a smattering of nervous, obsequious laughter. Dr. Marcus Thorne, senior attending physician and self-appointed king of this fluorescent-lit domain, smirked, his chest puffed out under his pristine white coat. His target, the new hire, didn't so much as flinch. She stood by the trauma bay supply cart, her back mostly to him, her movements a study in quiet efficiency as she methodically restocked saline bags and checked the seals on intubation kits. Her name was Anna Petrova, and her file said she had transferred from a small rural clinic, a detail Thorne had latched onto with predatory glee. She was small, as he'd so crudely pointed out, with a plain face and brown hair pulled back into a severe, functional bun. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, a fact that seemed to offend the doctor's very sense of being. He thrived on noise, on drama, on the clear demarcation of hierarchy, and her silence was a strange, unnerving vacuum in his world. But when the hospital's chief of surgery, Dr. Elias Vance, a man who had seen more than his share of real problems in operating theaters from Kandahar to Kiev, happened to glance at the security monitor in his office and saw not the woman, but the way she stood, a subtle, balanced posture of perfect readiness, her weight distributed evenly, her head on a swivel even while her hands worked. A cold knot of recognition tightened in his stomach. He saw a stance he hadn't seen in 20 years, a ghost from a world of sand and shadows. If you believe that true strength is measured not in words spoken, but in deeds done, type competence below. The silence that followed Thorne's insult was more damning than any retort. Petrova simply finished her task, her hands moving with a practiced economy that was almost hypnotic. Each vial, each sterile package, was placed with an unnerving precision, her fingers never fumbling, her focus absolute. It was this unnerving calm, this complete lack of reaction, that seemed to infuriate Thorne more than anything else. He was a man who fed on reactions, who built his fragile sense of authority on the flustered apologies and intimidated stammers of his subordinates. Petrova gave him nothing. She was a stone wall against which his ego simply crashed and crumbled. He saw a meek, unimpressive woman, a bureaucratic error, diversity hire perhaps, who would be utterly useless when the pressure mounted. The other staff, caught in the gravitational pull of his arrogance, saw the same. They saw her plain gray scrubs, her worn but clean running shoes, the absence of makeup or jewelry. She was a blank slate, an anomaly in a profession often filled with vibrant, assertive personalities. They mistook her stillness for fear, her silence for weakness. They made assumptions, the most dangerous and common of human errors. They assumed that because she did not boast, she had nothing to boast about. They assumed that because she did not engage in the ER's typical gallows humor or frantic gossip, she was aloof or simple-minded. These assumptions flowed around her like a toxic tide, yet she remained an island of tranquility, her expression placid, her breathing even. This was her camouflage, honed in environments far more hostile than a hospital corridor. It was a deliberate projection of non-threat, a way to become part of the background, to observe and assess without being observed in turn. She wasn't just restocking a cart. She was mapping the room, memorizing the locations of every piece of equipment, noting the exits, tracking the movements of every person within her line of sight. Her mind was a silent supercomputer, processing threat vectors and logistical solutions with a speed that would have terrified them if they could have glimpsed it. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, the distant wail of an incoming ambulance, the frantic chatter of the charge nurse. It was all data, processed and filed away. Thorne, meanwhile, continued his peacocking, loudly critiquing a junior resident's stitching technique, his voice echoing with theatrical authority. He was the storm, all bluster and noise, convinced of his own power. He had no idea he was standing in the presence of the quiet, patient, and infinitely more dangerous eye of the hurricane. The tension in the room was a palpable thing a low hum of resentment and anxiety that Petrova registered as a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure. She knew this pattern: the loud man, the fearful followers, the unstable environment. It was a formula she had seen play out in dusty villages and bombed-out cityscapes. And she knew, with a certainty that was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat, how it would end. The setup was a classic crucible, a pressure cooker of ego and exhaustion, and it was into this volatile environment that the catalyst was introduced. The automatic doors to the ambulance bay hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, a sound that usually heralded the controlled arrival of paramedics and a neatly packaged patient on a gurney. This time it was different. The doors were thrown apart, not by a machine, but by a man. He was a mountain, a slab of muscle and fury poured into a ripped flannel shirt and stained jeans. He stood well over 6'5", with a barrel chest and arms thick as tree limbs, his face a mask of rage, contorted by some potent cocktail of alcohol and narcotics. Two hospital security guards, brave but hopelessly outmatched, clung to him like barnacles on a whale, their feet barely touching the ground as he raged. "Get off me," he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that drowned out every other sound in the ER. He shook them off with a contemptuous shrug, sending one careening into a row of plastic chairs and the other stumbling back against a wall. The man's eyes, bloodshot and wild, scanned the room, looking for a challenge, for a focus for the storm brewing inside him. The ER, a place of managed chaos, descended into pure pandemonium. Nurses scrambled for cover, patients shrieked from their beds, and the delicate ecosystem of care shattered into 1,000 pieces of primal fear. Dr. Thorne, who just moments before had been the undisputed alpha of the room, froze. His face went pale, his bravado evaporating like mist in a harsh sun. He took a half-step back, his hand instinctively going to his phone, a useless gesture of a man whose only weapons were words and procedures. "Somebody call a code strong. Get the police down here now," he yelled, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of its earlier arrogance. His command was lost in the bedlam. The giant took a step forward, then another, his heavy boots thudding on the linoleum floor. He swiped a tray of medical instruments from a nearby cart, sending scalpels and forceps clattering across the floor with a terrifying crash. He was a force of nature, an avalanche of pure, unreasoning violence, and the structures of civilization were crumbling before him. The remaining security guard made a valiant but foolish attempt to intervene, drawing his taser. The man laughed, a horrifying, guttural sound, and charged. He batted the taser away as if it were a fly, and in the next moment, the guard was on the floor, groaning in pain. The behemoth now stood in the center of the ER, unopposed, a king in a realm of terror he had created. He pounded his chest, a primal display of dominance. The staff were paralyzed, trapped between their duty to their patients and their instinct for self-preservation. It was in this frozen moment, this tableau of fear and helplessness, that a single, quiet movement drew the eye. It was Petrova. She had not screamed. She had not run. She had simply moved, placing herself between the raging man and the most vulnerable patient, an elderly woman on oxygen whose bed was directly in his path. Her face was a mask of absolute calm, her body language utterly devoid of fear. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a sentinel. Thorne saw her move, and a flicker of something, disbelief, annoyance, even a morbid curiosity, crossed his face. "What is she doing?" he muttered to himself, convinced he was about to witness a tragedy born of utter stupidity. He saw the 100-pound nurse. He saw the 300-pound brute. The math, in his mind, was simple, brutal, and absolute. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong, and the lesson would be one that resonated through the sterile halls of Mercy General for years, a testament to the chasm between seeing and truly perceiving. The brute fixed his wild eyes on the small figure who dared to stand in his path. A cruel, predatory grin split his face. He had found his focus. "You," he growled, pointing a thick, grimy finger at Petrova. "You're gonna move." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of what he believed to be an undeniable fact of physics and power. To everyone else in the room, it was a death sentence. They saw a lamb standing before a lion, a twig in the path of a flood. They braced for the inevitable, for the sickening crunch of violence, for the scream that was sure to follow. But the scream never came. Petrova did not speak. She did not plead. She simply watched him, her gaze analytical and unervingly steady. While everyone else saw a monster, she saw a collection of anatomical data points. She saw his unstable center of gravity, the way he favored his right leg, the slight tremor in his left hand that betrayed a specific type of stimulant. She saw the predictable arc of his aggression, the telegraphing of his movements. Her preparation was not a flurry of motion, but a subtle, internal shift. Her breathing deepened, slowing to a meditative rhythm that oxygenated her blood and sharpened her focus. Her shoulders, which had been set in the neutral posture of a healthcare worker, dropped and squared almost imperceptibly, a micro-adjustment that aligned her entire musculoskeletal structure for optimal balance and power. She gently pushed the supply cart she had been stocking a few inches to her left, a seemingly insignificant act that cleared a precise lane of engagement. To Thorne, who watched with a horrified fascination, she appeared to be doing nothing at all. He saw only a foolish, stubborn woman about to be annihilated. He failed to see the quiet, deadly geometry of the professional at work. The giant charged. He closed the 10 feet between them in two massive, earth-shaking strides, his arms outstretched, his hands like shovels ready to grab and crush. The ER held its collective breath. The sound of his roar was the last thing anyone heard before the world seemed to shift on its axis. Just as he reached for her, Petrova moved. It wasn't a retreat or a dodge. It was an explosion of precise, economical motion. She flowed forward, not away, entering his space, moving under the arc of his grasping hands. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to guide, deflecting his right arm just enough to turn his own momentum against him. Simultaneously, her body dropped lower, and her right hand, fingers rigid and held together in a formation that was definitely not taught in nursing school, drove upward into a specific point, just below his rib cage, the solar plexus. The impact was almost silent, a soft thud that was swallowed by the cavernous space of the ER. For a half second, nothing happened. The giant was still upright, his forward momentum carrying him past her. His face wore an expression of profound confusion, as if his brain couldn't process the signal his body was sending. Then his eyes rolled back in his head. All the air evacuated his lungs in a single, whooshing gasp. The massive frame, all 300 pounds of it, went completely limp, the strings of motor control instantly severed. He didn't just fall. He collapsed, folding in on himself like a building being demolished, crashing to the linoleum floor with a heavy, final thud that shook the entire room. He landed in a heap, unconscious before he even hit the ground, his rampage over as suddenly and completely as it had begun. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a deafening, ringing void that was more profound than the preceding chaos. Every single person in the ER, doctors, nurses, patients, the recovering security guards, stared, their minds struggling to reconcile what their eyes had just witnessed. They had seen the impossible made real. The aftershock of the giant's fall was a wave of pure, unadulterated shock that washed over the entire emergency department. People stood frozen, their mouths agape, their minds replaying the last 3 seconds on a disbelieving loop. The sequence of events was so fast, so efficient, so utterly at odds with the perceived reality of the situation that it felt like a glitch in the universe. The mountain had charged, the mouse had moved, and the mountain had fallen. It made no sense. Dr. Thorne was the picture of cognitive dissonance, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The smug arrogance had been wiped clean, replaced by a raw, naked bewilderment. He looked from the unconscious heap on the floor to the small, unassuming nurse who now stood over him, and his brain simply refused to compute. He uttered the one phrase that perfectly encapsulated the collective sentiment of the room. No way. That's not possible. His voice was a hoarse whisper, the last gasp of a worldview that had just been irrevocably shattered. Petrova, in stark contrast, was the epitome of post-engagement calm. Her breathing was even, her posture relaxed. She knelt beside the unconscious man, her professionalism immediately reasserting itself. Her fingers went to his neck, checking for a pulse. She gently rolled him into the recovery position, her movements as calm and practiced as if she were simply turning over a patient in a bed. She noted the rhythm of his breathing, checked his pupils with a pen light she produced from her pocket, and began a primary survey for any injuries he might have sustained in the fall. She was a nurse again, her brief, shocking display of martial prowess vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The rest of the staff began to stir, slowly coming out of their trance. A few nurses cautiously approached, their faces filled with a new, profound respect. The security guards, now picking themselves up, looked at her as if she were a superhero. They had tried to stop him with equipment and brute force. She had stopped him with a quiet, almost invisible technique that bordered on magic. The atmosphere in the ER had been fundamentally altered. The fear was gone, replaced by a buzzing, electric sense of wonder. The established hierarchy, with Thorne at its apex, had been completely upended. Power, they were all learning in real time, was not about volume or title. It was about competence. It was about the ability to bring order to chaos, to be the calm center of the storm. And in that moment, the quietest, most overlooked person in the room had proven herself to be, by far, the most powerful. The legend of Anna Petrova was born in that deafening silence, in the space between the giant's roar and the solid, final thud of his fall. It was a story that would begin as a whispered rumor and grow into an institutional myth, a cautionary tale for the arrogant and an inspiration for the humble. The epicenter of this seismic shift was the small woman now calmly applying a pressure bandage to a cut on the brute's forehead, her focus as absolute in care as it had been in combat. Just as the whispers started to fill the void, a new presence made itself known. The doors from the administrative wing swished open, and Dr. Elias Vance, the chief of surgery, walked into the ER. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, with a presence that commanded instant respect without ever needing to raise his voice. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, his sharp eyes taking in the entire scene at a glance. The stunned staff, the recovering security guards, the unconscious giant on the floor, and the new nurse calmly tending to him. There was no surprise on his face, only a deep, knowing gravity. He had watched the entire event unfold on the security monitor in his office, his initial flicker of recognition hardening into absolute certainty. He walked directly to where Petrova was working, ignoring everyone else, including a pale and trembling Dr. Thorne. Vance stopped a few feet away, his gaze not on the downed man, but on Petrova's hands, the way she worked, the efficiency, the lack of any wasted motion. That was a textbook system of takedown, Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed room. Specifically, a nerve cluster strike to the celiac plexus. Haven't seen that performed outside of a Fort Bragg training exercise in a very long time. Petrova looked up, her expression unreadable. She simply met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He's stable, doctor. Pulse is strong. Respiration is shallow but steady. I suspect a polysubstance intoxication with secondary head trauma from the fall. Her report was clinical, precise, devoid of any emotion or acknowledgement of the extraordinary event that had just occurred. Thorne, finally finding his voice, stepped forward. Dr. Vance, we had a situation. This man, he was out of control. I don't know what she did. Vance turned his cool, appraising gaze on Thorne. And for the first time, Thorne felt the full weight of his superior's disapproval. It was not angry, but something far worse. It was disappointed. What she did, Marcus, Vance said, his tone clipped and authoritative, was her job. Just not the one you assumed she had. Vance pulled out his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen as he accessed the hospital's secure personnel database. He found Petrova's file. Most of it was heavily redacted, flagged with security classifications that made his eyebrows rise. Let's see here, he said, speaking to the room at large, his voice taking on the quality of a judge reading a verdict. Petrova, Anna. Previous employer. Listed as federal contractor. Let me translate that for you all. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the stunned faces of the ER staff. His voice dropped, becoming a staccato rhythm of revelation. Unit. Classified. Deployment history. Redacted. Specialization. Combat trauma. Advanced field medicine. SEER instructor. He paused, letting the weight of the acronym survival, evasion, resistance, and escape sink in. Commendations. Numerous. Mission classifications. Tier 1 operational support. He looked directly at Thorne, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Marcus, you asked her what she would do when a real problem came through that door. You have your answer. You were looking at a paper pusher from a rural clinic. I'm looking at one of the most highly trained and decorated combat medics this country has ever produced. The revelation hung in the air, a stunning, irrefutable fact that recontextualized everything. The quiet demeanor, the unassuming appearance, the methodical efficiency. It all snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. This wasn't weakness, it was discipline. It wasn't meekness, it was control. Dr. Vance let the silence stretch, allowing the full impact of his words to settle upon the assembled staff. He then did something that no one in that hospital had ever seen him do before. He turned to face Petrova, who had now finished her initial assessment and was standing up. He drew himself to his full height, squared his shoulders, and gave her a short, formal nod of his head. It was not the gesture of a hospital administrator to a subordinate. It was the silent, profound acknowledgement of one veteran to another, a gesture of immense and deeply earned respect that transcended rank and title. Welcome to Mercy, General, Sergeant, he said, his voice laced with an authority that was absolute. The use of her former, unlisted rank was the final, devastating blow to every assumption that had been made. The room seemed to shrink, the focus narrowing to the two of them, a bridge of shared, unspoken experience connecting them across the sterile linoleum floor. The validation was complete, public, and undeniable. Vance then turned his attention back to the wider audience, his gaze sweeping over the nurses, residents, and particularly Dr. Thorne. His tone shifted from respectful to pedagogical, the wise elder correcting the grave errors of the ignorant. Let this be a lesson to every single one of you, he began, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Assumptions are the termites of professional respect. You judge by the cover, you will misread the book every single time. You looked at Nurse Petrova and you saw what you wanted to see, a quiet, unassuming woman you could easily dismiss. You failed to see the discipline forged in crucibles you cannot even imagine. You failed to see the competence that is so profound, it has no need for advertisement. He took a step toward Thorne, who visibly flinched. You, Marcus, are an excellent physician. Your diagnostic skills are top-notch, but your judgment of people is appalling. You confuse confidence with competence. You mistook arrogance for authority. The loudest voice in the room is often the emptiest. True professionals do not need to announce their presence. Their work, their actions, their very being speaks for them. He gestured toward Petrova. She did not say a word. She did not boast. She did not posture. When a crisis erupted, while you were shouting for others to solve the problem, she became the solution. She assessed, she acted, and she neutralized a threat to her patients and her colleagues with minimal force and maximum efficiency. That is the definition of a professional. That is the standard to which you should all aspire. The public rebuke was scalding. Thorne stood there, stripped bare of his ego, his face burning with a shame so intense it was painful to witness. He had been humbled not by a superior's private reprimand, but by the quiet, irrefutable actions of the very person he had so publicly belittled. The irony was a bitter pill, a medicine for an ailment he never knew he had. The rest of the staff looked down, ashamed of their own complicity, their nervous laughter now echoing in their minds as a chorus of ignorance. They understood now. The silence of Anna Petrova wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of training, experience, and a level of self-control that was, in its own way, far more powerful than the brute force she had so effortlessly subdued. She was the living embodiment of the creed that actions, not words, are the final arbiter of worth. The story of what happened in Trauma Bay 3 spread through Mercy General like a contagion, but instead of disease, it carried a potent dose of awe and humility. It started with the ER staff, who recounted the tale in hushed, reverent tones in the break room. They spoke of the giant's terrifying entrance and Dr. Thorne's panicked response. But the climax of every telling was the same: the quiet, impossible moment when the new nurse, the one everyone had written off, moved with a speed and precision that defied belief. The phrase "she dropped him in seconds" became a piece of hospital shorthand, a code for unexpected, overwhelming competence. From the ER, the legend traveled with patients being admitted to the ICU, carried by nurses giving their handoff reports. It was discussed over lukewarm coffee in the surgical lounge, debated by residents in the on-call rooms. The security team, who had the clearest view from their monitors, told the story with the zeal of converts, describing the takedown frame by frame. They called her the Quiet Storm. The story took on a life of its own, becoming a modern piece of hospital folklore. Details were embellished, as they always are. Some said she never even touched him, that he was felled by a focused stare. Others swore they saw a faint blue aura around her hands just before the strike. But the core of the story, the undeniable truth of it, remained: a triumph of quiet skill over loud arrogance. The effect on Dr. Marcus Thorne was profound. For 2 days, he was a ghost, performing his duties with a mechanical precision, his usual booming voice reduced to a near whisper. The swagger was gone, replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. The staff gave him a wide berth, unsure how to interact with this new, humbled version of their former tormentor. On the 3rd day, he found Petrova stocking a different supply cart, her routine as unchanged and methodical as ever. He approached her quietly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his white coat. He stood there for a full minute before he could speak. "Nurse Petrova," he started, his voice low and strained. "Anna," she stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her expression neutral. "What I said to you when you first arrived, there is no excuse for it. It was arrogant, unprofessional, and just wrong. I am sorry." The apology was raw and genuine. It had cost him dearly to utter it. Petrova simply watched him, her calm gaze seeming to see right through the layers of his bluster to the frightened, insecure man beneath. After a long moment, she gave a single, curt nod. "Apology accepted, doctor," she said, and then she turned back to her cart, the interaction for her clearly over. For Thorne, it was a beginning. He started to listen more and talk less. He began to ask the nurses for their opinions, treating them as colleagues rather than underlings. The change was gradual, but it was real. He had been publicly broken down, and in the process had been given the chance to rebuild himself into a better doctor and a better man. The legend of Anna Petrova did more than just humble one arrogant doctor. It began to subtly reshape the culture of the entire hospital. Her quiet corner of the ER became a kind of informal sanctuary. Younger nurses and residents, tired of the ego-driven posturing that often dominated medicine, would find excuses to work near her. They wouldn't ask her directly about what happened. The event had already taken on a mythic quality that felt inappropriate to discuss so plainly. Instead, they would ask her advice on practical matters: how to de-escalate a frantic family member, how to stay calm during Code Blue, how to organize a trauma bay for maximum efficiency. Her answers were always the same: short, practical, and deeply insightful. She taught them to control their breathing to lower their heart rate. She showed them how to use positioning and body language to project calm authority. She demonstrated techniques for restraining patients that relied on leverage and joint control rather than brute strength, ensuring the safety of both the patient and the staff. These impromptu lessons became a coveted part of the hospital's unwritten curriculum. A small plaque mysteriously appeared on the wall next to where the giant had fallen. It was simple, anonymously placed, and read, "The Petrova line. Do not cross without a good reason." Hospital administration, under Dr. Vance's quiet direction, chose to let it remain. It became a landmark, a physical reminder of the day the hospital's definition of strength was rewritten. Petrova herself, remained unchanged. She deflected all praise with a quiet, "I was just doing my job." She seemed almost oblivious to the aura of respect that now surrounded her, a silent field of energy that parted crowds when she walked down the hall. Her focus remained squarely on her patients and her duties. But her influence was undeniable. The ER's efficiency metrics began to improve. Staff morale, particularly among the nurses, saw a significant upswing. There was a new sense of cohesion, a shared understanding that the team's strength lay not in its loudest members, but in its most competent ones. A photo of the ER team was taken for the hospital's annual report a few months later. In it, Dr. Thorne stands slightly behind Petrova, his expression one of quiet respect. Petrova herself is barely noticeable, standing near the back, her face placid and unremarkable. But to anyone who knew the story, she was the clear and undisputed center of the frame, the quiet fulcrum around which their entire world now turned. The artifact of her legend wasn't just a plaque on a wall. It was an improved confidence of a young nurse calming a scared child, in the newfound humility of a senior doctor listening to a junior colleague, in the safer, more respectful environment that her one, decisive action had helped to build. Her competence had become a quiet, powerful force for positive change, rippling outward in ways she would never acknowledge, but which would be felt for years to come. Months bled into a year, and the story of Anna Petrova's first week at Mercy General became institutional folklore, a foundational myth told to every new class of residents and nurses. It served as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a core lesson in the hospital's culture. Remember the Petrova line, senior staff would tell newcomers. "Here, we judge people by what they can do, not by what they say they can do." The ER was a different place. The frantic, ego-driven chaos had been replaced by a calmer, more focused and collaborative atmosphere. Dr. Thorne, now the head of the department, was a transformed man. He mentored young doctors with a patience and humility that would have been unthinkable before. He often used his own story as a teaching tool, a stark example of the dangers of assumption and the virtue of quiet professionalism. The Petrova method, an official de-escalation and crisis management protocol based on the principles she had quietly taught, was now mandatory training for all hospital staff. It had reduced staff injuries by over 60% and had become a model for hospitals across the state. Anna Petrova, for her part, was still just Anna. She had been promoted to charge nurse, a position she accepted with her usual lack of fanfare. She still wore the same simple scrubs, her hair pulled back in the same severe bun. She still spoke in short, direct sentences. But the way people saw her had been permanently altered. Her silence was no longer seen as emptiness, but as a deep reservoir of strength and wisdom. Her calm was no longer mistaken for passivity, but recognized as the profound discipline of a master of her craft. Her presence alone was enough to bring a sense of order to the most chaotic of situations. One evening, a terrified young resident was struggling to insert a central line on a crashing patient. His hands were shaking, his voice cracking as he called out vital signs. The room was descending into panic. Petrova appeared at his elbow, her arrival so quiet he didn't notice her at first. She didn't take over. She simply placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said, her voice a low, calm anchor in the storm. "You know the steps. See it. Do it." Her quiet confidence was a transfusion. The resident took a deep breath. The shaking in his hand subsided, and he successfully placed the line on his next attempt. He looked at her afterward, his eyes filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. She just gave him a small, affirming nod and moved on to the next task. That was her legacy. It wasn't in a single dramatic moment of action, but in the countless small moments that followed. It was in the competence she nurtured in others, the confidence she quietly instilled, the culture of respect she had unknowingly forged. True legacy isn't something you build for yourself. It is the strength that continues to grow in others long after your actions are done. It is the quiet, persistent echo of competence in a world too often distracted by noise. The lasting impact of Anna Petrova was not a monument or a medal, but a fundamental shift in the hospital's collective understanding of value. The institution learned that the most critical assets are often the ones that do not advertise themselves. The true measure of a person's worth is not found on a resume or in a boastful declaration, but in their response to a crisis. It is revealed in the heat of the moment, in that critical juncture where talk becomes useless and only action matters. The story of the new nurse who dropped a giant in seconds became more than just a thrilling anecdote. It became a parable for the entire organization. It taught them to look past the superficial, to seek out the quiet professionals, to cultivate an environment where competence was the only currency that truly mattered. Years later, Dr. Vance would sit with a new group of hospital board members, explaining the remarkable turnaround in their emergency department's performance statistics. He pointed to improved protocols, better training, and enhanced security measures. But then he would pause, a knowing look in his eyes. He would tell them that the real change began not with a new policy, but with a new person, a person who reminded everyone that the most powerful force in any organization is a single individual who embodies absolute, unwavering competence. The Petrova line on the ER floor was now worn and faded from countless feet and gurneys passing over it, but its meaning was more ingrained than ever. It was a symbolic threshold between chaos and control, between assumption and respect. New nurses would touch it for good luck on their first day, a small ritual connecting them to the legacy of the quiet professional who had set the standard. Anna Petrova eventually moved on, recruited by an international aid organization that needed her unique skills in a far more dangerous part of the world. She left as quietly as she arrived, with no farewell party, just a simple note of thanks left on her locker. But she never truly left Mercy General. She remained in the calm confidence of a nurse facing a difficult patient, in the humble curiosity of a doctor listening to his team, and in the shared belief that true strength makes no sound until the precise moment it is needed. Her legacy was the silence, the deafening, powerful silence of proven, demonstrated, and undeniable skill. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where professional respect defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.